Everything you ever wanted to know about Tankies, but were afraid to ask, by Mike Harman from the LibCom website. One of the stranger developments of the past 5 years has been the resurrection of the word tanky. It's time for an explainer. What does tanky mean? On October 27th, 1956, Peter Fryer, a member of the Communist Party of Great Britain and correspondent for its paper, The Weekly Worker, arrived in Hungary. This was 4 days into an uprising of workers calling for worker-controlled socialism. Factories had been taken over nationally by workers' councils. In a demonstration of worker self-organization that was unprecedented at the time, and the first strike on its scale in an Eastern Bloc country. On the 4th of November, Russian T-54 tanks rolled into Budapest to suppress the uprising. Street fighting continued until the 10th of November, although the workers' councils held out for 2 months. Fryer returned to the UK horrified by the Soviet repression he had seen, but his attempt to write about it for the Daily Worker was suppressed. The editors were sticking to the official USSR line that the entire uprising was a fascist counter-revolutionary plot and refused to publish anything contradicting that narrative. When Fryer wrote up his experiences anyway, he was expelled from the Communist Party of Great Britain. Hungary in 1956 split communist parties across the world. Many who had supported the USSR up until this point became disillusioned and split or left individually, while those who stayed loyal to the USSR earned the epithet Tankies. After 1956, the USSR was to invade Czechoslovakia in 1968, then Afghanistan in 1979. Are all tankies Marxist-Leninists? While the original tanky epithet grew out of the split in the Communist Party of Great Britain, the geopolitical anti-imperialist, in quotes, support for the USSR and any state aligned against the USA has also been popular among some Trotskyist groups. In the 1980s, it was revealed that the Trotskyist Workers' Revolutionary Party, famous for the involvement of actress Vanessa Redgrave from The Devils. If anyone's never seen the movie The Devils, Vanessa Redgrave's in it, and it's fucking phenomenal. It's Halloween time. Get it together. In the 1980s, it was revealed that the Trotskyist Workers' Revolutionary Party, famous for the involvement of actress Vanessa Redgrave, had been receiving funding from Libyan intelligence services and passing details of Iraqi dissidents into the UK to Saddam... I'm going to repeat that whole thing. I'm sorry. In the 1980s, it was revealed that the Trotskyist Workers' Revolutionary Party had been receiving funding from Libyan intelligence services and passing details of Iraqi dissidents in the UK to Saddam Hussein. In the USA, the Workers' World Party and Party for Socialism and Liberation both originated in a split from the Trotskyist Socialist Workers' Party under Sam Marcy. Marcy split from the Socialist Workers' Party of the USA over the position it took on Hungary in 1956, although somewhat bizarrely also accused those who supported the uprising of being Stalinists. Both parties describe themselves as Marxist-Leninists now and no longer cite Trotsky, but their origination was in the Trotskyist theory of the USSR as a, quote, deformed workers' state. So support for crushing of workers' movements is shared by both some Marxist-Leninists and some Trotskyists. One explanation for this is that the actual politics of Stalin and Trotsky were not very different. Are all Marxist-Leninists Tankies? The significance of Hungary was not only the uprising itself, but that it occurred in an Eastern Bloc country which was claiming to be socialist. This caused an existential crisis for any communist that still considered the USSR to be a workers' state. Along with Khrushchev's speech to the 20th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in February 1956, exposing and denouncing many of the actions of Stalin. It was at the same time that Mao began to gradually distance China from the USSR. Maoism had already become a distinct current, but without any formal break, which was precipitated by Khrushchev's speech and the international reaction to it. Both China and the USSR claimed to be the vanguard of Marxist-Leninism from this point onwards. From here sprang a million accusations of, quote, revisionism. This was mostly due to the national interest of the two countries and internal contradictions in China, but was expressed politically as a split with Khrushchev. The split between China and the USSR, between Maoism and Stalinism, had repercussions elsewhere, such as the multiple splits in the Communist Party of India in the mid-1960s, most often associated with the Naxalite rebellion, might be pronouncing that wrong, or when the two countries supported opposite sides in Angola's civil war in the 1970s. Tanks rolled in Tiananmen Square in 1989, and those who supported the Chinese government against workers and students have sometimes been labeled Tankies too. This means that Marxist-Leninists in the 1960s could include those still aligned with the USSR, those who had been aligned with the USSR but had split after 1956, those influenced by Maoism. Marxism, Leninism, Maoism was coined later in the 1990s. And even more confusingly, some Trotskyists would occasionally call themselves Marxist-Leninists too, because they were Leninist Marxists. Are all Leninist Marxists Marxist-Leninists? There have been other historical criticisms that were influenced by Lenin, including Trotskyism, the Italian branch of left communism, and the Aprismo workerist tradition in the 1960s and 1970s Italy, as well as major figures like C.L.R. James, early on a Trotskyist and leading Pan-Africanist, later moving towards a council communist position. There are huge differences between these currents, as wide as the differences between anarchists and, quote, Marxists. Quote, anarchists and, quote, Marxists. In terms of a relationship to Lenin, we can identify some questions which most of these currents and others have had to answer. Whether Lenin's work contains unique insights relative to other Marxists at the time. Whether Lenin was correct that Russia would have to pass through a capitalist stage prior to communism, and that the task of the Bolshevik Party was to raise the forces of production prior to a transition to communism. Whether the conditions of Russia in 1917 apply to the US in 1960 or to anywhere in the world in 2018. Whether the USSR was still revolutionary after 1921 or 1927 or 1956 or 1981. The answer to these questions led Marxists like C.L.R. James to abandon, quote, Leninism almost entirely, while still retaining an admiration of Lenin, the thinker and historical figure. Were the Black Panthers Tankies? Some Black Panthers, such as Fred Hampton, described themselves as Marxist-Leninists, but were more influenced by the writings of Lenin and Mao and the context of Vietnamese resistance to U.S. invasion and African liberation struggles than the internal or foreign policy of the USSR. Huey Newton, in 1970, introduced the idea of, quote, revolutionary intercommunalism, a clarification of ideas which firmly rejected socialism in one country. And this is a quote from Huey Newton. In 1966, we called our party a black nationalist party. We called ourselves black nationalists because we thought that nationhood was the answer. Shortly after that, we decided that what was really needed was revolutionary nationalism. That is, nationalism plus socialism. After analyzing conditions a little more, we found that it was impractical and even contradictory. Therefore, we went to a higher level of consciousness. I feel like I have a burp in my throat. Sorry, Huey. We saw that in order to be free, we had to crush the ruling circle, and therefore we had to unite with the peoples of the world. So we called ourselves internationalists. We sought solidarity with the peoples of the world. We sought solidarity with what we thought were the nations of the world. But then what happened? We found that because everything is in a constant state of transformation, because of the development of technology, because of the development of the mass media, because of the firepower of the imperialists, and because of the fact that the United States is no longer a nation but an empire, nations could not exist, for they did not have the criteria for nationhood. Their self-determination, economic determination, and cultural determination has been transformed by the imperialists and the ruling circle. They were no longer nations. We found that in order to be internationalists, we had to also be nationalists, or at least acknowledge the nationhood. Internationalism, if I understood the word, meant interrelationship among a group of nations. But since no nation exists, and since the United States is in fact an empire, it is impossible for us to be internationalists. The transformations and phenomena require us to call ourselves intercommunalists, because nations have been transformed into communities of the world. I don't see how we can talk about socialism when the problem is world distribution. I think this is what Marx meant when he talked about the non-state. Former Black Panthers such as Russell Maroon Schultz and Lorenzo Comboa Irvin, sorry for mispronouncing names, both of whom spent years in prison for their association with the Black Panther Party, have broken with Marxism-Leninism after seeing how the Leninist structure of the Black Panther Party made it vulnerable to the FBI's COINTELPRO program. Or COINTELPRO, however you want to pronounce it. And by examining the trajectory of Leninist revolutions. So the Black Panther Party wasn't a monolithic entity politically, and the individual politics of the Black Panther Party's members, as well as the orientation of the party itself, changed over time. Rather than claiming it was any one thing, we can read what Black Panther Party members actually wrote in their own right. And the Revolutionary Black Workers? The League of Revolutionary Black Workers, based in Detroit, described themselves as Marxist-Leninists. But they had close relationships with associates of C.L.R. James, such as Martin Glaberman, Grace Boggs, and James Boggs, who had broken with Leninism more than a decade earlier, while also being influenced by Fanon and others. Once again, the politics are a bit more complex than the labels. What about anti-imperialism? Anti-imperialism means different things to different people. Fundamentally, to be against imperialism means support for working class struggles against colonialism and opposition to capitalist war. Unfortunately, anti-imperialism has often morphed into simply taking the side of the USSR in geopolitical conflicts and post-1990 unconditional support for the ruling class in any country aligned against the United States. Lenin in 1914 wrote in The Rights of Nations to Self-Determination that communists should support the right of nations to secede, but not the specifics of any particular national struggle. This is because Lenin saw nationalist movements as essential to the development of capitalism over feudalism as a step on the way towards communism. There's a quote from Lenin. Throughout the world, the period of the final victory of capitalism over feudalism has been linked up with national movements. For the complete victory of commodity production, the bourgeoisie must capture the home market, and there must be politically united territories whose populations speak a single language, with all obstacles to the development of that language and its consolidation in literature eliminated. Even within this state, that's end quote, even within this stage's framework, Lenin still ultimately stated that the class struggle should take absolute precedence over the nationalist movement. The bourgeoisie always placed its national demands in the forefront, and does so in categorical fashion. With the proletariat, however, these demands are subordinated to the interests of the class struggle. The important thing for the proletariat is to ensure the development of the proletariat's class. For the bourgeoisie, it is important to hamper this development by pushing the aims of its own nation before those of the proletariat. This is why the proletariat confines itself, so to speak, to the negative demand for recognition of the right to self-determination, without giving guarantees to any nation, and without undertaking to give anything at the expense of another nation. End quote. Additionally, while American imperialism in 1916 was not at the level it is now, Lenin also rejected the hypocrisy of simply playing off one imperialism against another. In Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, he writes, quote, "Let us suppose that a Japanese condemns the annexation of the Philippines by the Americans. The question is, will many believe that he does so because he has a horror of annexations as such, and not because he himself has a desire to annex the Philippines? And shall we not be constrained to admit that the, quote, fight the Japanese is waging against annexations can be regarded as being sincere and politically honest only if he fights against the annexation of Korea by Japan and urges freedom for Korea to succeed from Japan." Succeed. I don't know if I pronounce. I always feel succeed. Secession. I don't know. For some reason, the E. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. In War and Revolution, Lenin wrote, "Nothing but a workers' revolution in several countries can defeat this war. The war is not a game. It is an appalling thing taking toll of millions of lives, and it is not to be ended easily." Lenin therefore saw anti-imperialist struggles, that's the end of the quote. Lenin therefore saw anti-imperialist struggles as being in the realm of bourgeois national revolutions, something to, quote, critically support, but subordinated to the class struggle, dismissing inter-imperialist conflicts with the slogan, quote, "turn the imperialist war into civil war," end quote. Didn't the USSR support African national liberation? Sometimes, but only when it supported the USSR's own geopolitical interests. C.L.R. James described his conversation with George Padmore, who had joined the Communist Party and moved to the USSR in 1929 before leaving in 1934 due to the purges and a change in orientation. This is from C.L.R. James. But one day, sometime in late 1934 or 1935, there was a knock at my door. And I went to the door, and there was George Padmore. He said, "I've left those people, you know." And that was the biggest shock I received since I had gone to Brazil 3 years before. "I have left those people" meant he had left the Communist Party. And he was the biggest black man in Moscow, dealing with black people and colonial revolution. So I said, "What happened?" And he said, they are changing the line. And now they tell me that in future we are going to be soft and not attack strongly the democratic imperialists, which are Britain, France, and the United States. That the main attack is to be directed upon the fascist imperialists, Italy, Germany, and Japan. And George, we would like you to do this in the propaganda that you are doing and in the articles that you are writing and the paper you are publishing to follow that line. And George said, that is impossible. Germany and Japan have no colonies in Africa. How am I to say the democratic imperialists, such as the United States, is the most race-ridden territory in the Western world? How am I supposed to say the democratic imperialists, such as the United States, is the most race-ridden territory in the Western world? So I am to say that Britain and France, who have the colonies in Africa and the United States, can be democratic imperialists and be soft to them, but be strong against Japan, Italy, and Germany. That is impossible. What do you think of that? Isn't criticizing the USSR anti-communist? There is a tendency by everyone from conservatives to liberals to social democrats to criticize the, quote, crimes of communism and ignore the actions of capitalist countries. This is complete shit, and we reject it completely. While there were famines and bread riots in the USSR in the 1930s, British policy caused the Bengal famine, killing 3 million people in 1943. While the USSR and China have imprisoned political dissidents, including many communists and anarchists, the USA has the highest incarceration rate in the world, with some political prisoners held in solitary confinement for decades, and 1,000 extrajudicial killings by police per year. While Lenin deported dissident Bolsheviks like Myasnikov and presided over the crushing over the Kronstadt Rebellion, Social Democrats in Germany oversaw the assassination of Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht in collaboration with the fascist Freikorps. While the USSR had gulags, Britain put hundreds of thousands of Kenyans and Malayans into concentration camps in the 1950s. And there were forced labor camps in the UK itself in the 1930s under Labour. While the U.S. healthcare system leaves people without medical care and destitute, Cuba, despite economic sanctions, has socialized healthcare and trains healthcare workers for other countries. Liberal myopia sees a horseshoe where liberal democracy is, quote, reasonable. Let me repeat that. Liberal myopia sees a horseshoe where liberal democracy is reasonable, and fascism and communism are two poles of, quote, authoritarianism. A libertarian communist critique asserts that communism is impossible within the framework of the nation state, and that all states, whether fascist, liberal, democratic, or socialist, will suppress workers' self-organization in the interest of capital. What about Syria, Iran, and North Korea? A central line of communist and anarchist thought and praxis has been internationalism and opposition to war in all its forms. This caused the split in the Second International in 1914, when German Social Democrats voted for war credits. However, putting this into practice turns out to be a lot more complicated. With the war in Syria, opposition to U.S. intervention, shared by all communists, though not necessarily social democrats, has been marred by support for some organizations for the Syrian government and Bashar Assad and Russia, despite the bombing of civilians, on the basis that areas such as eastern Ghouta are held by Islamist militias, and that 400,000 civilians trapped there are being used as, quote, human shields. This is further complicated by Rojava, supported by both some Marxist-Leninists and some anarchists. Due to the Marxist-Leninist orientation of the PKK, the libertarian municipalist ideas recently adopted by the PKK's leader, Öcalan, I hope I pronounce his name right, Abdullah Öcalan, the Tev-Dem system of administrative councils, and the right to national self-determination of the Kurds. On the other hand, both some Marxist-Leninists and some anarchists and anti-state Marxists have been fiercely critical of Rojava. Due to the collaboration militarily with the U.S. against ISIS, and most recently with Assad against Turkey. It says, on Libcom, we've continued to allow publishing of texts both critical and supportive of Rojava, and regularly get attacked for being NATO shills for both, whether it's the U.S. against Assad or Turkey against Rojava. With Iran, despite the religious nature of the regime and the fact that all communist parties are banned, when strikes and street protests broke out at the end of December 2017, there was an immediate reluctance to recognize the grassroots nature of the actions due to the possibility that the U.S. might use the protests as an excuse for, quote, regime change. Some commentators went as far as to suggest that the protests had been almost immediately hijacked by the CIA, Mossad, and Saudi Arabia. The case of Iran and Assad show that in these discussions, the internal contradictions of a country can be completely ignored. With the central question always being, quote, is the country aligned with the U.S. or not? On the one hand, celebrating Assad's attacks against Islamists, on the other, celebrating Iran's religious state against the Haft-Tape sugar workers or leftist students. Our position is that regardless of the actions of the Iranian or Syrian state, we completely oppose foreign intervention, whether U.S., Russia, or Turkey, on the base that the foreign intervention always makes things worse. But to oppose intervention does not require a denial of the internal contradictions of those states or the reality of working class resistance to those states. The same applies to North Korea. We reject under any circumstances U.S. intervention in North Korea. Hawks in the U.S. talking about a nuclear weapons program gloss over the U.S. bombing Japan twice in 1945, let alone the use of depleted uranium shells against civilian areas in Iraq. But to reject sanctions and intervention can rely on a principled anti-militarism and internationalism, solidarity with the North Korean working class, and not with Kim Jong-un personally. As we would support the Gwangju uprising in South Korea in 1980, we would support worker struggles in North Korea too. Let me get a sip of some Joe here. But communist parties are very successful in India, Japan. While the CPI, but communist parties are very successful in India/Japan, ? While the Communist Party of India, Marxist, likes to hold huge rallies with hammer and sickle flags, its policies are social democratic. It runs for elections and where it wins pursues pro-business policies. In Kerala, the new communist administration under Pinarayi Vijayan stressed partnerships between management and trade unions and promised investment to stimulate industry, including, quote, Silicon Valley-like hubs, end quote. Not quite seizing the means of production, then. The Japanese Communist Party with several members in the Japanese parliament Diet abandoned Leninism 25 years ago, deciding to pursue a purely electoral road to socialism, and has recently attempted to work with centrist liberal MPs. They might be popular communist parties, but they aren't communists at all. What about American Marxist-Leninists? Are they social democrats too? The Marxist Party for Socialism and Liberation's program also sounds suspiciously social democrat if you actually read it. For example, quote, "It will be a right of every person in the United States to have a job with guaranteed union representation and full social benefits provided by the socialist government, including a pension, health care, workers' compensation, paid parental and family leave for up to 2 years, paid sick and disability leave, a minimum of months paid vacation, and at least 12 paid holidays." Isn't this Sweden? Another quote from the program, Party for Socialism and Liberation program. "Working conditions will aim to enhance the humanity and dignity of all workers. The working week will be 30 hours. That's 10 hours less than Bernie's offering, but not quite the abolition of wage labor. Suppose that the Party for Socialism and Liberation is just one. However, the Party for Socialism and Liberation is just one party. And you will also see Marxist-Leninists oppose electoral activity, working on prisoner solidarity, etc. The important thing is to actually read what people say they want and observe what they do, not just listen to what they say about themselves or check whether there's a hammer and sickle or a rose printed next to the promise of full employment. These aren't the things that decide whether someone is communist or not. Liberals just call anyone they don't like a tankie. This is often true. There has been regular red baiting of mild social democrat. There has been regular red baiting of mild social democrat Jeremy Corbyn, recently accusing him of being a spy for East Germany in the 1980s. The right wing of the Democrats at one point was calling any Bernie Sanders supporter a Russian-influenced alt-leftist. William Gillis of the Center for a Stateless Society recently said of us, quote, "Remember when LibCom was about as tanky and class reductionist as you would ever encounter in the radical left, and we all view them as evil, suspicious bastards because they wouldn't outright ID as anarchists? Presumably due to our hosting and promotion of anti-state and post-Leninist Marxists. Therefore, if someone is using tanky, they might be objecting to a specific leftist ideology that prioritizes geopolitics over class struggle, or they might just be punching left. When liberals have a go at, quote, communism, they often mean the Soviet Union. And let's be honest, sometimes it's tempting to tell people they'll be first in the gulags after the revolution when they do this, especially if it's fucking Jordan Peterson. Should I work with Marxist-Leninists? If you're organizing at work or around some housing issue, the people you work with are not going to all have the same politics as you, and your opinions on the July 1918 uprising of left socialist revolutionaries after their expulsion from the Bolshevik government are not relevant to that situation. Yes, really, no one gives a shit. You're relating to each other as workers in that situation, not as representatives of a political niche. At least we hope not. Anarchists and Marxist-Leninists have also worked together as members of anti-fascist collectives in the United States and elsewhere, and this is really a choice for people to make locally. Things you should bear in mind when organizing are, however, cooperation with individuals is very different from a left unity project, coalitions of organizations, etc. The question to consider when a group is organized in, for example, an anti-war protest is are they going to try to divert a protest into an ineffectual rally, or cooperate with the police if protesters try to step outside strict limits of activity? Similarly, with workplace organizing, do co-workers have links with the union hierarchy or management? Approaches to this differ from organization to organization and is not strictly linked to ideology. If there are real political and organizational disagreements, it's better to be open about them than gloss over them and retain some independence.